Hello YouTube, Bane 666 here. So this is part 2 of my reply to Dawn and Deadpool, who replied to Propaganda of Toxic Feminism Part 48. So if you haven't watched Propaganda of Toxic Feminism Part 48, I recommend you go watch it now before watching this. Otherwise this video might not make as much sense. And you should probably watch Part 1 in this reply series as well. As last episode I replied to the Deadpool part. This episode I will be concentrating on comments from Dawn. Yeah, she left rather long comments in my comment section, so I'll be going through that. And I'll also be looking at some other comments she's left on some other videos, because it seems Dawn is a very interesting character. But more on that later. So, without any further delay, let's look at the first comment.
Bane, I am going to give you the benefit of the doubt and assume that because it was a very long conversation, you missed the part that I was specifically addressing the group of self-identified MRAs in my local area and not the men's rights movement as a whole.
So Dawn acts a little bit patronizing here, and Dawn, you really don't get to act patronizing when you've presented zero evidence so far. Okay, so you know, basically put up or shut up would be a good bit of advice for you. But let's look at your comment. You basically say that I must have missed the part in the conversation where you're specifically talking about a group of local MRAs. Now you know this is false, because I contacted you through Russian Deadpool asking you about that specific group, and you actually replied. Second of all, numerous times in my video I do mention that you are talking about a local group. But let's be honest here, Dawn. On numerous occasions during that 5-hour video, that 5-hour interview that you did, you connect this local group with the movement as a whole. Now let me play you a clip demonstrating this. In the clip you're about to hear, Dawn starts out talking about a 5-hour hangout that I did with Spinosaurus, Dean Esme, Nick Redding from Men's Rights Edmonton, Senor Mini Bagel, and Brian Martinez from the Honey Badgers. I'll put the link below to the entire hangout. So she starts talking about that, and she's referring to us as they. And then she just slides into talking about the supposed local group of MRAs and how they started specifically to stop shelters, to end shelters. But she just slides from one to the other as if there's no difference. It's all the same thing. Anyway, here's the clip.
It's, you know, when you listen to them, even the 5 hours you people sat through, I don't know how, but kept getting cut off, and all they want to do is just toss the insult. They said they developed specifically in opposition to shelters and the work that we do, and trying to end it, because the men that started this had been all through the court system, that had restraining orders against them, had put women in shelters, and they congregated together and started attacking the shelter under the guise of men's rights and under the guise of society not being fair to them.
So she started talking about us, a group of YouTube MRAs, and then just slid into talk about the local group, supposedly. And anyone listening would not know the distinction between these two things. They would just assume that she's talking about, you know, the same group, the same movement, with everyone thinking the same thing. But she even gets more specific when she once again is talking about the local group, and she refers to them as having the Paul Elam mindset, which is clearly a connection to the men's rights movement as a whole. Here's the clip.
What would you? How do you know that it was the MRAs in your area that told these people where the secret shelters are?
They publicized it on a website.
Okay.
There's very much a group of the Paul Elam mindset, and I kind of get confused because I know there's even some dissension among their own ranks between what anti-feminism, MRA, MGTOW, all of that stuff. I know they've got their own sort of dividing lines, and I'm not sure where those lie.
So, of course, this is just a dirty trick done by Dawn, because even though she talks about a local group, she is insinuating that they are representative of the entire men's rights movement. Now, I have my doubts as to whether they actually exist, because Dawn has presented zero evidence to suggest that they actually exist. All we have to go by is hearsay, Dawn's word, which we know is unreliable. We don't know if Dawn is misrepresenting them because of her misunderstanding. She could be misidentifying them, or she could be outright lying. All these things are possibilities. And given Dawn's track record of contradicting herself, the lying allegation is very, very likely. But she insinuates that, these men are obviously representative of the movement as a whole, but when she's called out on it, she falls back on but I was only talking about a local group. You clearly misunderstand what I'm saying. Yeah, bullshit, Dawn. Absolutely fucking bullshit. Furthermore, as we'll see in a couple of minutes, once again, this distinction between the local group and the movement as a whole, in your own words, it gets very fuzzy. In your very comment that you left to me, it's confusing about who you're talking about. We'll see that in a minute. But one more point I should bring up, and this is more of a criticism of the Skeptic Feminist than Dawn. But the Skeptic Feminist cut out a 10-minute clip called MRAs versus Domestic Abuse Shelters and posted it on their channel. They didn't call it a local group of MRAs versus Domestic Abuse Shelter, or local group which does not represent the movement as a whole, or alleged MRAs versus Domestic Abuse Shelters. Considering there's no evidence that these guys even exist, I think alleged MRAs would have been a minimum requirement, don't you think, Russian Deadpool? But instead it's posted in such a way, a gotcha moment. See, we're proving that the MRAs are really misogynist. They're against domestic abuse shelters, and we're just going to use this to accuse the entire movement of this, even though apparently it's a local group which doesn't represent the entire movement and may not even exist. Because, once again, all we have is hearsay. No actual evidence whatsoever. Dawn has refused to give us the slightest bit of evidence so far. But let's move on to Dawn's next comment.
At the time that this group popped up, there were no anti-feminists.
Really? It's a strange comment to make there, Dawn, because there have been anti-feminists as long as there has been a feminist movement. Now, that's not to say that I, as an anti-feminist, agree with everyone who is an anti-feminist. For example, if you have a fundamentalist Christian or a fundamentalist Muslim or whatever who thinks that men should be the provider, protector, and women should stay at home and do the housework and look after kids, I disagree with that. I think those roles are actually harmful. Or, if we go back to the suffragette movement, there were people protesting saying that women shouldn't have the vote. I obviously disagree with them, as I think everyone should have the vote, both men and women. Mind you, there were legitimate criticisms of the suffragette movement at the time, but obviously not all the criticisms were legitimate or fair. As I said in Propaganda of Toxic Feminism, Part 48, the term anti-feminist, the people who identify as anti-feminists are far, far more diverse than those who call themselves feminists. But I digress. The point is that there have been anti-feminists around as long as there have been feminists. I would think this is obvious. To suggest that these people just popped up in the 90s shows you don't really have a very good understanding of feminism and anti-feminism and history and probably anything else. But let's go on to the next comment. This one is somewhat confusing.
In fact, the term sprang up relatively recently only because some legitimate humanists wanted to separate themselves from the negative association with the MRAs who were responsible for putting women in shelters and then claiming they were the true victims. These were men who had criminal records for violent offenses and gathered specifically to combat the help and support their female partners were getting.
Okay. Not exactly sure what she's going on about here. So the term anti-feminist was only recently created by humanists who wanted to separate themselves from violent MRAs who were victimizing their wives or whatever. Yep. So my question for Dawn is this. When she's referring to MRAs here, is she referring to the local group that she talks about, the local ones in her town? If so, she is in fact claiming that the term anti-feminism originated in her small country Canadian town. I find this claim to be a little hard to believe. Alternatively, if she isn't talking about the local MRA group, then she is talking about the men's rights movement as a whole, and here she clearly states that they are responsible for putting women in shelters and claiming that they were really the victims, and that these men have a violent criminal record, blah blah blah. You know, all the stuff she claims at the start of her comment that she never said about the men's rights movement as a whole. So which is it, Dawn? Are you saying that the term anti-feminist originated in your country hometown in Canada in the 90s? Or are you suggesting that all MRAs are violent men who want to shut down shelters and victimize their wives and partners? Which one is it? Because this is just confusing garbage. It really, really is. But let's go on to the next comment.
These were often the worst of characters who used the language of men's rights to claim they were truly being abused by shelters and feminists who were brainwashing women into believing in things like marital rape and financial abuse.
Citation needed. Oh, hold on, I forgot. Dawn doesn't do evidence. That's right, she just makes allegations and expects people to believe her word without providing any evidence whatsoever. Isn't that right, Dawn? Gee, it must be easy to operate like that. Definitely less time consuming than what I do. But anyway, I find it interesting that she uses the term language of men's rights, because I've heard this argument numerous times before. It usually goes something along the lines where someone will accuse someone of being a men's rights activist who has no connection to the movement. The perfect examples are Elliot Rodger and Rush V. And when you challenge them on this, they will say, well, person X may not identify as a men's rights movement, but they use the language of the men's rights movement, therefore they actually are a men's rights activist. Now, the one thing that all these people making these claims have in common is that they are referring to a stereotype of men's rights activists. And this stereotype is actually built on falsehoods, on false associations like Elliot Rodger and Rush V. It's the worst type of circular argument, where they make a stereotype, then they find examples to fit the stereotype, and then they use these examples to justify the stereotype. It's a circular argument. And I suspect this is what Dawn's doing here, based on her language and based on her comments to date, both in the video and in messages like this. I think she's referring to a straw fedora, as I like to call it, a stereotype of men's rights activists, which is based on falsehood. But by all means, Dawn, prove me wrong. Give me a citation, show me some evidence, prove yourself right. You're the one making the claim. It's your responsibility to provide the evidence. Oh, but that's right, you don't do evidence, do you? Let's move on to the next comment.
Please remember, this was long before the internet was widely being used and YouTube was not yet born.
Yeah, I'm not sure the relevance of her comment about the internet or YouTube, so let's continue.
The idea of men's rights was laughable, being that I resided in a very small community and people were aware of that. The men claiming to be victims of evil, brainwashing feminists were bullies with reputations for assaulting a wide array of people, including police officers in addition to their wives. It was very much a ploy, and their false victim narrative was absolutely used to counter social efforts at getting help for the women and children who needed protection. Again, I was addressing a very specific group of people and not the MRM as a whole.
So here once again, Dawn claims to be just talking about the local group of MRAs, and that's fine, right? Except earlier on, she did say, in reference to the term anti-feminist, in fact, the term sprang up relatively recently only because some legitimate humanists wanted to separate themselves from the negative association with the MRAs, who were responsible for putting women in shelters and then claiming they were the true victims. So is she actually claiming that the term anti-feminist originated in her hometown by local humanists? Once again, I find this claim incredibly hard to believe, which makes me think that earlier on she was actually referring to MRAs as a whole, or the movement as a whole. But now once again she claims to only be talking about the local group. Once again, this is something she goes back and forth with, where she's talking about the local group and then she merges it seamlessly into the group, the movement as a whole, and then back again. And we're apparently not meant to notice this. It's also interesting that she uses the term false victim narrative here. She tends to use that a lot. She uses this term in a later comment, which I'll focus on coming up. You may find that very offensive, by the way. I know I fucking did. And I think it really shows what type of person Dawn is. But we'll get to that a little bit later. Trust me, you're going to want to see that part. But we should go on to Dawn's next comment for now.
I don't have time right now to finish listening or respond to your video, but I am really not impressed with your seemingly made-up mind that I am an idiot who doesn't know anything about the MRA or anti-feminism.
But Dawn, in the 5-hour interview you did with Russian Deadpool, you admit numerous times that you don't have a good understanding of the men's rights movement and anti-feminism.
Okay.
There's very much a group of the Paul Elam mindset, and I kind of get confused because I know there's even some dissension among their own ranks between what anti-feminism, MRA, MGTOW, all of that stuff. I know they've got their own sort of dividing lines, and I'm not sure where those lie.
And as Russian Deadpool even says,
we understand your anger at her ignorance of the MRM, the men's rights movement. Ignorance she openly admits to and attempts to have cured during the course of her discourse with us.
And need I mention yet again that Dawn herself says that she gets most of her information about the men's rights movement from anti-MRA videos on YouTube. I could play you the clip, but yeah, you should have seen it by now if you're watching this. And I'm not going to repeat all the clips I used from Propaganda of Toxic Feminism, Part 48, because you should have seen it if you're watching this. And I really don't want to bore you by using all the same clips over again. So all the evidence is already presented there, but let me present you with some new evidence that you haven't seen before. Once again, these are the words of Dawn. So let's start with the comment she left on the Skeptic Feminist video, Androcentrism, which is about a 6-minute clip they took from their interview with Paul Elam. Dawn says in that comment,
anyone who knows the men's rights activism of Elam will immediately understand that he is hearing the accusations being lobbed at them, that they are white, male supremacists, and adjusting his narrative the only way he can to survive beyond the fringes.
Oh, Paul Elam apparently is a white male supremacist. That's interesting. Of course, Dawn will never ever provide any evidence for this, even though apparently she's now an expert on the men's rights movement. It's not like she gets all her information from anti-MRA videos and articles which make these type of claims. Oh no, of course not. No, Dawn is clearly very well researched. She just chooses not to give us any of that evidence. Isn't that right, Dawn? Let's go on to another comment.
You hear AVFMers changing their tactics so that they can survive the growing publicity and the obviously racist narrative they used to push.
The obvious racist narrative they used to push. So obvious that Dawn is incapable of giving us any examples, of course, because Dawn doesn't do evidence. Do you, Dawn? Now you may well ask, where does this stereotype come from? Why is it that feminists like Dawn assert such things that MRAs must be racist and white supremacists? Well, part of it is obviously slander done to just, throw mud at the MRA label, and they tend to do that a lot. But I think another part of it comes from the assumption that if you disagree with feminists, you must be the opposite, the mirror image of every single thing that a feminist believes. So if a particular feminist believes in is a left-winger, for example, then all MRAs must be far, far right-wingers, right? That's the logical conclusion. If a feminist is pro-choice, then all MRAs everywhere must be anti-abortion. If a feminist believes in equality for women, then the evil MRAs must want to take away rights of women, put them back in the kitchen and take away the right to vote. This even gets so fucking crazy that we have the mainstream feminists claiming that MRAs are anti-trans because, well, mainstream feminism is pro-trans rights, right? So we must be anti-trans because we're the mirror image, correct? Yet at the same time, the TERFs, the trans exclusionary radical feminists, claim that anyone who is pro-trans rights must be an MRA. This shit just gets fucking crazy. And of course, if feminism, modern day third wave feminism, is about equality between the races, then, well, those evil MRAs must be white supremacists who are only supporting the evil white man.
If you really want to talk about disparity, Native men, black men, I don't hear the MRA sticking up for them at all. I hear them saying, well, black men commit the most crime, blah, blah, blah. I don't hear them defending men and saying, what can we do so that they don't feel like they have no other choice but committing these crimes? How can we support this population? How can we make this better? I don't hear any of that. All I hear is, oh, this white guy got a sentence and it's not fair.
I see this time and time again. It's always based on complete ignorance of the men's rights movement. It's always based on stereotypes, and there is never any evidence. But by all means, Dawn, if you can show me some of this obvious racist narrative that you talk about, feel free to post it down in the comment section. It's not really that hard. Let's go on to another comment.
He must start pushing the narrative that all men are really being harmed by the gynocentrism of all cultures. He wants a piece of the expanded market for donations if he convinces men in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and all the world over that they are the truly devalued and oppressed by gynocentric religions and governments that claim to care about women so much that they are provided for and comfortable doing domestic servitude to men than the poor, hard-working, disposable man that has to provide for the woman and her children.
Now here we see the allegation that MRAs like Paul Elam are just in it for the money, which we hear all the time from Dawn's side of the fence. In fact, we've heard it from Dawn before as well.
What do you think about, like, I kind of wonder, like, at the end of the day, these newer channels that are popping up trying to get onto this economy of anti-feminism.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
I guess I was just kind of wondering out loud about these new channels that are popping up, or the bigger channels that are now focused, instead of on atheism, on anti-feminism, and the economy around that. I'm just wondering how sincere people can really be if they're getting paid a lot of money to put this stuff out. Like, there's just, like you said earlier, there's no room for debate then, because they have a vested interest in being right.
Oh, I see. That's a very interesting argument, Dawn. So if someone is making money from something, they automatically have a vested interest in being right, and therefore, without actually addressing their arguments, we can just dismiss them as being wrong, right? Because they're biased, because they're making money. Is that your argument, Dawn? That's what it sounds like. So let's use Dawn's logic for a moment and see what we get. Using Dawn's logic, that means we can take all the books on feminism, which have been written by feminists, explaining feminist ideology in great detail. We can take all those books and we can just throw them away and dismiss them, because presumably the authors have made money out of it. Therefore they must be invested in that belief, right, Dawn? And that means they mustn't have considered the other option, that maybe they're wrong. So using Dawn's logic, all that can just be automatically dismissed without even addressing any of the arguments they make or any of the evidence they present. Oh, hold on. I forgot one key point. Dawn only applies this to our side. Sorry, Dawn, I forgot. You only apply this logic to our side. What about a case where a woman in the workplace gets sexually harassed and she takes the employer to court and sues the employer and gets a huge payout? Once again, using Dawn's logic, because there's financial incentive, we can automatically dismiss her claim as being fake or non-existent. Once again, let me stress, this is Dawn's logic, not my logic. Oh, but hold on a second. I forgot. Dawn only applies this logic to our side. Isn't that right, Dawn? What about the many feminists on YouTube who make money out of their videos? Lacey Green is doing quite well. Mamboobs Futrell, I know he's mainly got a website and doesn't really make many videos on YouTube, but he gets donations as well. Manchie's, also known as Diana Boston, also known as Sale Palani, the notorious transphobic radical feminist who I've shown in the past has purposely doctored footage of Paul Elam because, she couldn't make a point otherwise. Who also Dawn quite likes, by the way, having read some of her comments. She also makes money off of YouTube and the internet and her feminism. And even the skeptic feminists.
However, if each of our subscribers and viewers were to donate just $1, just $1, that's like one McDouble, one small fry. It's like one taco. $1. To our Patreon page, we'd be able to fully support the Skeptic Feminist without any out-of-pocket expenses.
So I guess we can just dismiss anything they say without actually dealing with any arguments they make. Right, Dawn? Because they're making a buck, so therefore they must have some evil motive to get rich, and we can just dismiss them without even considering that they might be right. Oh, hold on, I forgot. Dawn's logic only applies to us, not to people on her own side. Now, let me be clear here. In my own opinion, what someone does with their own money is their own choice, right? If you want to give it to the Skeptic Feminist, if you think they make good content, by all means go and donate to their Patreon. If you think I do good content, then by all means donate to me, or Sargon, or Kevin Logan, or Thunderfoot, or Karen Strawn, or even Mancheese. Now, I think Mancheese is a despicable character. I think she is a bigot, and I think she's somewhat insane. And she's been proven before to really be a dishonest fucking asshole. But I still hold true to the principle that if you want to donate to her, then you should go and do so. Your money, your choice. But of course, this is just another stereotype created or propagated by Dawn. It's a way of dismissing someone's arguments without actually addressing them. Instead of actually listening to what they say and putting up counter-arguments, which takes time and effort, you can just say, oh, well, they're only in it for the money, they have an ulterior motive, why do we even have to listen to them? This is, of course, bullshit. It's no different than slandering someone by claiming they're a white supremacist. It's really fucking lazy, is what it is. Intellectually lazy, Dawn. Really fucking lazy. Now, at this point, a couple of you may be saying, but Bane, what about Thunderfoot? Hasn't he accused Sarkeesian of doing this exact same thing? And that's true. Although I would argue that there is a slight difference. When Sarkeesian started her Kickstarter, she was looking for a specific amount of money to produce a specific number of videos within a specific amount of time. Now, she got, was it something like 10 times the amount of money that she asked for, yet she failed to produce the number of videos in the specific amount of time. She did not live up to her part of that agreement. Whereas people on Patreon like myself and like the Skeptic Feminists and Karen and Random McCam and Kevin Logan and all the rest, if we don't produce something, we don't get paid. So there is a difference there. But once again, if you want to donate money to Sarkeesian, you're perfectly welcome to throw away your money if you want. Your money, your choice. But on that note, let's go back to the comment that Dawn left on my video.
I have been doing this work for 24 years and find your rather insulting assertion that I rely on stereotypes and misinformation to be exactly what you are relying upon in your many assumptions about me.
There's no assumptions about you, Dawn. I used your own words to demonstrate who and what you are. And there's a better example coming up towards the end. I am keeping the best until the end. It's interesting that you talk about stereotypes and misinformation, considering you refer to Paul Elam as a white supremacist who's only in it for the money. Yeah, that's not relying on stereotypes and misinformation at all, Dawn, is it? Not at all. Let's go on to your next comment.
I discuss the reasons why men can become abusive, not as a newsflash but in response to Russian Deadpool's question about whether they know it's wrong or not to abuse women. Feminists have long had an understanding of the cycle of violence as most of us learned it in our own homes and families. Many feminists actually see the pain in their fathers long before they date or marry an abuser. Many women feel that if they love an abuser enough, he will heal from his own issues around violence, and it is because they love these men that they are so committed to staying in spite of the violence.
Now, Dawn makes a couple of very interesting points here. So let me start my reply to this section by relating a personal story. Way back in the 90s, I had a very close friend who I also worked with who had a lot of anger towards Asians. You might, in fact, call him racist towards Asians as a group. Now, normally he wasn't a racist person. Normally he wasn't bigoted. Normally he, treated everyone equally and had respect for everyone. But when it came to Asians, he had a particular hate, a particular dislike. And as someone who can't stand racism, it's something we often talked about and disagreed on. Now, he wasn't raised in a racist home. He wasn't, a member of the KKK or whatever. But he did have a reason for thinking the way he did. You see, back in the late 80s, before I'd actually met him, one evening after dark, he was out walking his dog, and he was jumped by a gang of Asians. This resulted in him being stabbed, taken to hospital, undergoing surgery, and it left him with some pretty severe physical scars. But not just physical scars, it also left him with emotional scars as well. Even though he knew it was illogical to blame the whole demographic for the actions of a handful of people from that demographic, he felt that way anyway because of the trauma that he had been through. Now, over the 10 years that I worked with him and was close friends with him, he actually worked through this and his attitude changed. Because all along he knew it was illogical to blame the whole demographic for the actions of a few, but his attitude towards them came from a place of pain and trauma. And this caused a bias in him and a level of bigotry. Now, once again, this is understandable, but it's not excusable in my book. And obviously, he would have been the wrong person to ask about immigration or racism or race relations. He wasn't in a position of power or influence to influence those things. But if he was, he would have been the wrong person because he had a bias coming from emotional trauma. Do you see where this is going? Now, Dawn actually says here, feminists have long had an understanding of the cycle of violence as most of us learned it in our homes and families. Most. Dawn is claiming that most feminists come from violent backgrounds. Now, I would disagree with Dawn here. I think most feminists are probably what's often referred to as coffee shop feminists. They're feminists mainly in name and aren't really I guess you can call hardcore feminists. Now, the concept that most hardcore or dedicated feminists come from this background, that might actually be more reasonable. I haven't seen any statistics, so I can't say for sure, but I'm guessing that might actually be the case. If we're referring to those particular type of feminists, then Dawn might actually be right here. And if that is the case, if Dawn is right, then I have to ask, are these the right people to lecture us about masculinity and about gender issues? If they come from a background of pain and trauma, and let's face it, if they grew up in a home where there was constant violence from the father, then they'd be far more traumatized than my friend who was stabbed and went through that. So, because their trauma would have been over a number of years. If they come from that trauma and that pain, how can they not be biased? How can they not be bigoted? How can they not let their anger and pain cloud their logic and their clarity? And I think this goes to explain a lot of feminist theory. I think this actually explains why feminists often only see the negativity of masculinity and only the positives of femininity. And we see this with Dawn. I mean, yeah, sure, when she's asked about male victims of female perpetrators, she does acknowledge that they exist. I give her credit for that when she's asked. The rest of the time, what she talks about when she refers to male victims are male victims who are also male perpetrators. This is something we see again and again and again in the interview she did, as well as her comments. She talks about male abusers who are victims as well, and I would agree that the vast majority of them do come from abusive backgrounds and have grown into the role of abuser based on their background. I agree with that. And I agree that we should be doing something to put a stop to that. But the fact that, unless asked, the only way she sees a male victim is as an abuser, I think is pretty telling. Now, I think it's unclear whether Dawn comes from an abusive background when she was a child. This comment makes me think that maybe she did, although I don't recall her saying in the interview or in comments anywhere that she has. So that bit's unclear, although I think it's a reasonable possibility. We do know, though, that she had a violent marriage in which apparently her life was threatened. And we do know that she has worked in domestic violence for 24 years and seen some horror stories. Some absolute fucking horror stories by her own words. And I have to ask the question, when you come from that background, when you work in that industry and you see that every day for 24 years, and you're surrounded by other people with similar backgrounds, how can you not be biased? How can you not let emotion and trauma and your own experience influence the way you see males and gender as a whole? I think it's a fair question to ask, especially considering it's a point that Dawn brings up and makes herself.
I actually had some hope that you would be at least honest and factual in your representation of the conversation that I had with the skeptic feminists, but so far I get the impression you have an agenda that has nothing to do with fair representations.
For fuck's sake, Dawn, could you use some commas or some more full stops or something, just some kind of punctuation? It would make it easier to read your comments. Plus, breaking it up into paragraphs might be nice too. But more on that in a little while. As for her accusations that I somehow had an agenda, note that word, and that I wasn't honest or factual in my representation of the conversation, it's an interesting interpretation, Dawn, because I used your own voice, your own statements. I supplied time codes so people could easily find those points in the 5-hour conversation and listen to the entire thing in context. I made it as easy as possible for people to see that I wasn't taking things out of context and to be as transparent as possible. You, on the other hand, Dawn, you're yet to supply any evidence. All we have is hearsay and a handful of stereotypes and misinformation. Now, you may disagree with my information, and you're perfectly free to put up a video criticising it and giving examples where I wasn't honest or factual. By all means, Dawn, please do so. You have the time codes. It's easy for you to look up those bits. I'd be very interested in your response. But even if you disagree with my evidence, at least I've presented some. Unlike you. Next.
You miss many of my points, and since you are not an obtuse person, I have to wonder if you are deliberately mischaracterizing my positions or if you really are not listening to my points in full context. It appears more and more to me that you are being willfully misinformed.
And here we have the perfect example of Sargon's Law. So Dawn did leave another comment on my video. It was a much shorter comment, so let's quickly deal with that, because I've got something really big to get to in a minute.
Also, I never said that these particular men were interested in shutting down shelters. I said they worked in direct opposition to the work we were trying to do, and you made assumptions without listening to what I actually said.
No, I did actually listen to what you said, Dawn. You used the word end. They're trying to end shelters and the work that you do. As I said in my response to Deadpool, could you please tell me how trying to end a shelter is not shutting down a shelter? How do you end shelters without shutting them down? By all means, Dawn, please explain that to me.
I was referring to their direct opposition in family courts and opposing the changes in law that mandated police lay charges if they had evidence of assault instead of asking victims if they wanted to press charges in front of their abusers.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how that's meant to end shelters and the work that you do, Dawn, but yeah, anyway. I did address those particular laws, well, the American version of those particular laws, in a video response I did to Garrett, so I'll link that below, as opposed to going through details about the law for another 30 or 40 minutes yet again, because I've actually got some very interesting comments to work through. Now, normally, guys, I don't give a trigger warning to you, but I gotta say I was really fucking pissed off when I read this next comment, and I suspect that you're going to be pissed off too. So if you have a drink in your hand, you may wish to put it down now. I just tell you this because I want to save you the expense of buying a new monitor. It really is that fucking bad. So, as I record this, it's the 29th of April, and just 3 days ago, on the 26th of April, it was the 3-year anniversary of the death of Earl Silverman. Now, Earl was a great man who ran a shelter for men, battered men, out of his own home, out of his own pocket. Unfortunately, though, after battling the system for many years, he committed suicide. Now, if you don't know a lot about Earl, I have a special interview after my credits, which you really should stick around to listen to. I'm not going to say who the interview is with at this point. I'm going to save it as a surprise, but it is well worth listening to. And we actually talk a great deal about Earl, the work that he did, and the situation in Canada with men and domestic violence. But for now, before we get to that, we still have some more comments from Dawn to work through. And like I said, if you're holding a drink or something in your hand at this point, you should probably put it down.
Actually, Earl Silverman was not a hero. I'm sorry, but he was not. He perpetuated the false narrative of ELM, and no politician in their right mind is going to support that effort and never will. If Earl was offering a legitimate place that dealt with the true realities of men's lives, he would have no issue getting funding to support his goals, but he supported the idea that women are as, if not more, abusive than men.
He would have no issue getting funding. Alright, so I'm not going to go into details here because all that will be addressed in great detail after my end credits in the interview that's coming up. Once again, trust me, you want to stick around and listen to that. It is well worth the wait. But let's just say that, yeah, Dawn isn't very factual at this point. You can take that as an understatement. But let's go on, because this gets worse.
He perpetuated the paranoia of the men who purport to live in a gynarchy.
Gynarchy. Well, it's interesting, because in the 5-hour chat Dawn did with Russian Deadpool, she accuses me of using the word gynarchy. Which is strange, because until a few moments ago, I'd never actually used the word. Once again, this is Dawn being factual and accurate as possible. But I'll address those comments towards me, made by Dawn, in a separate video coming up. For now, let's return to her comments about Earl Silverman.
He was so in-depth in his victim narrative that he killed himself before admitting that men have a violence problem and need all kinds of help to end their suffering.
Wow. Where do I start with this one? Now keep in mind, folks, the skeptic feminists are putting Dawn forward as a good example of feminism, what feminists should be. Not one of those straw feminists that apparently we attack all the time, but Dawn is one of the good, upstanding, shining examples of modern-day feminism that we all should respect. And is the reason why there shouldn't be anti-feminists like us. Yeah, you may have picked the wrong example here, guys. Just saying. So you'll see in Dawn's comment, once again, she uses the term victim narrative, which she often uses to refer to men's rights activists. Yeah, because we don't have any real issues. We're just, pretending to be victims. It's a term she uses over and over again, as I pointed out earlier in this video. And once again we see Dawn talking about violent men and ending their suffering, which almost sounds like she's talking about putting them to sleep, but I assume she's not referring to that. But the thing is, Dawn, Earl wasn't concerned with helping violent men. He was concerned with helping men who were victims of violent women. Unless asked, when Dawn talks about male victims, she frames it as male perpetrators. The only time she talks about male victims who are just victims, but not perpetrators as well, is when she is directly asked and has to answer without sounding like a bigot. Yep, an absolute shining example of modern-day feminism. But let's continue, because it gets worse from here.
And let me make this clear again. The men who are abusing women are usually guilt-ridden and heartbroken to find themselves stuck in a destructive pattern that works against what they want in their lives. They have grown up in abusive homes and may have been abused themselves. They never learned how to deal with their feelings and were told that their value as men was only in how well his family appears in public. Abusive men need, and often, want help to better relate to their families and put to rest the anger that constantly bubbles at the surface of their lives. They want to deal with their issues to become happier, healthier and see their children do better, but unless someone teaches them, they have no hope of figuring it out.
And once again, Dawn babbles on and on about men who are perpetrators also being victims. Because the only time she wants to talk about male victims is when they're also perpetrators. Unless she is directly asked, can men be victims? In which case she will answer. But every other time that I've seen, Dawn just goes on and on and on about abusive men also being victims and needing help. Now, although that is true, and that is a good point, as I've said numerous times, we also need to talk about men who are just victims. Believe it or not, Dawn, men can just be victims of violent women. And that's the men Earl Silverman was trying to help. The men who are just victims. The men who have nowhere else to go. The men that society and the system don't give a shit about. The men that society laughs at and makes fun of or disbelieves. The men that feminism minimises and dismisses as either being a insignificant number or not as badly hurt as women, or just not existing. And as Dawn said in the 5-hour interview, that feminism has only looked at one side of this for decades, and they're finally starting to look at the whole picture now. And she said this in such a way as if we should be proud of feminists for finally catching up after 40 years. Just fucking unbelievable. But let's continue, because there's still some more bullshit to get through yet.
The true men's rights activists are helping these men instead of frantically denying their existence, which only furthers to isolate and shame them.
When exactly has a men's rights activist ever denied the existence of abusive men, Dawn? Give us some examples, because I've never seen an MRA anywhere suggest that there are no abusive men in society. It is a bizarre argument to make. You know damn well our position is that women can be violent too, note the word too, and that men can also be victims. This does not mean that women can't be victims and men can't be victimizers. It's not one or the other, Dawn. You can have both at the same time, and I just find it bizarre. Absolutely fucking bizarre that you keep saying this thing, that we're somehow denying that there are violent men and female victims. It's just fucking bizarre. Of course we acknowledge they exist. But you know what, Dawn? We want help for the men who are ignored. For the men who don't have a voice. For the men that society doesn't give a shit about. That's who we're concerned with. Next.
Earl Silverman was a sad, broken man who could have benefited from assistance from a men's center that valued his experiences, and then helped him make peace with his past and move on to perhaps help others one day.
Now we know Dawn comes from an abusive marriage. I wonder how Russian Deadpool would have reacted if I referred to Dawn as sad and broken because of her past experiences. Now it is true, Earl Silverman was broken. He was broken by the system which he was trying to work within, The system that didn't give a shit about him or men in general. Once again, that is discussed at length after my end credits in the interview. And yeah, it is true, he could have benefited from a men's centre. What a shame. What a shame, Dawn, that there wasn't a men's centre. What a shame after 40 years of feminist doctrine telling us that only women suffer from domestic violence and that men don't have issues. What a shame after 40 years of that there was no men's centre for him to turn to. But we're wrong to criticise feminism, right? Now, sure, I know what your response is going to be. Well, why don't you do it yourself? Well, that's what we've been trying to do. That's what Cafe is doing. That's what Earl was trying to do. And we get no help from the government. And society in general doesn't give a shit. And when people like you, Dawn, devalue Earl Silverman and the work that he did and the pain that he went through, when scum like you do that, you make that job harder. And yeah, you are scum for talking about this man in that way. That is exactly what you are. Next.
To me, Silverman is the very embodiment of what happens when men are devalued and played upon by men like Elam, who tell him lies that prevent him from being able to deal with his experiences and find joy, something that is entirely missing from the current men's rights dogma.
Well, first of all, Dawn, what happened to Earl Silverman was 22 years ago. That was long before Paul Elam ever got into the men's rights movement and became a prominent MRA. So somehow Elam prevented Silverman from dealing with his issues. It is fucking crazy. Absolutely fucking crazy. Once again, some facts from Dawn. But it's not Paul Elam or the men's rights movement which is devaluing men, Dawn. It is society. Or I should say devaluing our pain, our experiences. And when men have had enough and they start a movement to try to address those things, we're called whiny, crying man babies and told to shut up by your side, Dawn. We see feminists, prominent feminists like Jessica Valenti, with drinking male tears cups and t-shirts, promoting the stereotype that men should just shut up about their pain. That's your side doing it, Dawn, not our side. Our side is actually trying to get men to talk about their issues and to have somewhere for men to go and to deal with their issues. That's not us devaluing men's pain, Dawn. It's society in general, and particularly people from your side. And you're doing it right here. When you talk about Earl Silverman in these ways, that's exactly what you're doing. Next.
I just sent a long message for you to consider. Please let me know your thoughts. But in the meantime, I just had to say that Earl Silverman is exactly the kind of person who needed to address his own issues. When you are depressed, angry and using suicide as a "fuck you" to society, you aren't going to be able to actually help anyone at all in that mind frame. All he could do was to spread the poison of the manosphere and, in my opinion, became the biggest victim of it himself.
Personally, I find it fucking disgusting the way Dawn talks about Earl Silverman, his death, and the work that he did. And I think it's clear evidence of the type of person that we're dealing with Dawn. Now, as you'll remember from the reply video that the Skeptic Feminist did to me, that Russian Deadpool addressed to me, he criticised me for attacking Dawn over her work in the shelter, which was a total straw man, considering I only addressed her references to the men's rights movement and didn't criticise her work in the shelter at all. But the way he framed it was, how dare I attack someone who does the noble work that Dawn does? So considering Dawn has just done exactly that to a man who opened a shelter in his own house to try to help men, who struggled against the system and paid for it out of his own pocket, considering Dawn has just attacked that man in exactly the way that Russian Deadpool accused me of attacking Dawn, you would expect a response from the Skeptic Feminist to these comments by Dawn. And here's that response. Oh, that's right, they didn't respond at all. No criticism whatsoever. Not even polite, friendly criticism. Absolutely nothing. Now, at this point, some of you are probably thinking, but Bane, how do you know they've even read the comment? Maybe they have just been busy and they missed that comment, or they haven't got around to responding to it. Surely that's a possibility. Yeah, the problem with that is they've actually replied to other people in the comment thread. So, yeah, it's pretty clear that they would have had to have read Dawn's comment and just ignored it. Now, very soon, you'll get to see the interview I've done at the end, which has a great deal of information about Earl Silverman, what he did, who he was, about his death, and about what he went up against in the legal system in Canada to try to get things done. The brick walls that he came up against constantly. It's a great interview. You're really going to want to listen to it. You'll get to listen to it very, very soon, but before we go on to that, there is one more thing that I want to address. It's something I really couldn't go past and just have to make a quick comment about here. And I have to admit that this is purely speculation. There is no concrete evidence. There is a fair amount of circumstantial evidence, but no concrete evidence. So let me stress that, and you'll probably get sick of me saying that, but I really have to, so my opposition doesn't strawman me and claim that, this is all I'm presenting or some such bullshit. So yes, circumstantial evidence, not concrete. I'll let you make up your own minds based on what I present. But I have a sneaking suspicion that Dawn has a sock account. Now, in case you don't know what a sock account is short for sock puppet account. It's a fake account someone has where they pretend to be someone else. Anyone who's been on YouTube for a little while would have seen at least one or two people doing this. Obviously, sock accounts are very hard to prove, and I guess in most cases impossible to prove. But there are certain things to indicate that an account might be a sock account. In my experience, there are three things which would indicate that an account is a sock account. Once again, let me stress, this is all circumstantial evidence, and I'll let you make up your own mind. And yes, you're going to get sick of me saying that, but I really have to stress it. So the first indicator that an account might be a sock account, and this is usually the indicator that tips off that an account might be a sock account. This is what tipped me off to the fact that I think this is a sock account. The first indicator is similar use of grammar and or argument. So you may have noticed in the examples I've shown of Dawn, when she's replied in the comment section, she tends to use one big massive block of text. She doesn't break it up into small paragraphs. And even if she does use paragraphs, the paragraphs are made up of huge blocks of text. This is her style. And this is the exact same style we find with Obsidian Forrest. Now, once again, this is just purely circumstantial. I'm sure there's lots of people on YouTube who do exactly the same thing. So this one thing by itself is not really evidence. It could just be a coincidence. There's more than two people, obviously, who do this, but that's not the only thing, obviously. Obsidian Forrest mentions that he or she has a daughter. Dawn also has a daughter. Once again, could just be a coincidence. Lots of people have daughters, right? So, by no means concrete evidence. Obsidian Forrest mentions in Canada, every 5 days a woman dies at the hand of her current or former partner. So it's fairly safe to assume that Obsidian Forrest is Canadian, right? And Dawn is also Canadian. But, once again, there's lots of people who are Canadian, so not necessarily the same person. Once again, just could be a coincidence. We're dealing with circumstantial evidence. Obsidian Forrest makes the argument that anti-feminists should stop listening to Tumblr and Twitter as our sources for examples of pop culture feminism. I seem to have heard that argument somewhere before. Let me think. Where have I heard that before?
You hear a lot about this third wave of feminism that's on YouTube and Twitter and Instagram. You hear a lot of complaints about Twitter feminism or whatever it is.
Tumblr, I think.
Tumblr
Yeah.
feminism with whatever. But like I said, that stuff hasn't trickled out into the world at large yet. It's a very, very small number of I'm thinking very young, mostly very young people who are...
Now, once again, that's not rock-solid evidence. It's just circumstantial. I mean, there's more than one person who has made that argument before. Doesn't necessarily mean that Dawn is also Obsidian Forrest. But it's not the only argument they have in common. For example, Obsidian Forrest says, I keep saying and will continue to say that anti-feminists have a misunderstanding of the terms we use. Patriarchy is not static in nature. It doesn't mean that men conspire to benefit over women. It merely is how society has evolved over time, with men dominating the leadership and direction of society. Now, note here, Obsidian Forrest says it's something that he or she continues to say. It's something they've said numerous times. And that patriarchy evolved over time, and it's not some secret plot that men just came up with. Although I'm positive I've heard feminists say that numerous times. But I've actually heard this argument before, that patriarchy just evolved over time. Let me think, where have I heard that before?
They're just not even willing to educate themselves on the most basic feminist theory.
Right.
Like patriarchy just happened. Nobody's saying there's a big conspiracy to implicate all men. It's just how humanity has evolved, and we find ourselves in this place where now we can look back and go, men have had the rule of things for a really long time. We need to make room at the table for women, and we need to make room at the table for Native people, and we need to make room at the table for disabled people. All we're doing is asking them to shove over and make room for some other people.
And Obsidian Forrest accuses me of having an agenda. And Dawn also accuses me of having an agenda. Now, once again, this could just be a coincidence, and I'm sure there's lots of people on their side of the fence who would accuse me of having an agenda. But there does seem to be an awful lot of similar comments from Obsidian Forrest and Dawn's account. In fact, I can't find anything that they disagree on. Could just be a coincidence. But they do seem to hold identical beliefs and make very, very similar statements, like this one made by Obsidian Forrest.
During the 5-hour chat, it was said that she was correcting her language because way back in the beginning of men's rights there was no such thing as anti-feminists. There was no such thing as YouTube, and coming from the bricks and mortar world, you have to jump through a lot of hoops to even find these conflicts.
Now, it is true, Dawn did say something along the lines of having to jump through a lot of hoops to find the gender debate that's going on YouTube, and that most people are unaware of it. That part I do remember her saying. However, I don't recall her saying that way back in the beginning of men's rights there was no such thing as anti-feminists. That's a very, very bizarre statement, and I'm sure if I heard Dawn say that in the 5-hour long video, I would have made note of it, because it's a weird thing to say. The closest thing I recall to a conversation anything like that is this.
Us and we retweeted there was like a website that has a bunch of old slogans and artwork of people who are against the suffrage movement, and they were making so many of the same anti-feminist arguments against those first wave feminists.
Thank you. That's also another point that I wanted to make and forgot, is that, yes, I started in this work 24 years ago, and when that law changed from police being afforded the decision-making ability in laying a charge or not laying a charge, when that was taken away and they were told, if you have evidence, you must lay the charge, that is when the MRA began. in the numbers and force that it is. It was not begun by men who were concerned about suicide or homelessness. It was started by men who were in the court system and had been told they needed to stop their violent ways if they wanted to see their children or reunite with their family. A lot of times people don't even realize that children's aid may go into a home.
Now that statement would seem to contradict what Obsidian Forrest is saying, because Russian Deadpool was talking about anti-feminists way back when the suffragettes were around, and then Dawn started talking about the men's rights movement only recently, starting in the 90s. But you know what, maybe I missed it. I'm not perfect. I haven't got every single minute of that 5-hour conversation memorized, thankfully. So if I have made a mistake, and if Obsidian Forrest or Dawn or Russian Deadpool or anyone else wants to leave a time code below in my comment section, by all means do so. I'll have a look at it, and if you're correct, I'll make a comment in a future video. But I really think I would have memorized. I think I would have taken note of any point where Dawn was saying that anti-feminism was born out of the men's rights movement sometime in the 90s. I'm sure I would have taken note of that, because it's a bizarre statement. And in fact, I have heard this bizarre statement once before. In fact, so have all of you. You actually heard it earlier on in this very video when Dawn left that very statement in my comment section. Dawn also left a very similar statement in the comment section of Russian Deadpool's reply video to me. So let's have a look at these three statements. The one from Obsidian Forrest, which is the statement which piqued my interest in and made me a little bit suspicious that maybe this was actually Dawn. And the two comments from Dawn. Let's compare all three of them together and see if they have anything in common.
At the time that this group popped up, there were no anti-feminists. In fact, the term sprang up relatively recently only because some legitimate humanists wanted to separate themselves from the negative association with the MRAs who were responsible for putting women in shelters and then claiming they were the true victims. Please remember, this was long before the internet was widely being used and YouTube was not yet born. During the 5-hour chat, it was said that she was correcting her language because way back in the beginning of men's rights there was no such thing as anti-feminists. There was no such thing as YouTube, and coming from the bricks and mortar world, you have to jump through a lot of hoops to even find these conflicts. The MRA was the only group of people fighting with feminists when they emerged in the 90s, long before YouTube and the online atheists who turned anti-feminists.
So all three comments make the claim that anti-feminism is more recent and it grew out of the men's rights movement, which has apparently been around longer. And each comment also mentions YouTube and online being only a recent thing. Now I know two of these comments are written by the same person. However, I suspect all three of them are actually written by the same person. Once again, not rock solid evidence, just speculation, circumstantial evidence. I'll let you make up your own minds. But I did say before that there were three indicators that an account may in fact be a sock account. I've discussed the first one, so what's the second one then? Well, when I read that comment by Obsidian about the term anti-feminism coming from the men's rights movement, and apparently it's only a recent term, and it reminded me of what Dawn had posted on my comment section. The very first thing I did was click on Obsidian Forrest's name and go and have a look at the account. And what you find is an almost completely blank account. Well, it is a blank account. There is no subscribers, there's no likes, there's no channel subscriptions, nothing. Now, once again, this is not rock solid proof, because there are other accounts on YouTube which are like this but are not sock accounts. But let's face it, the vast majority of sock accounts are in fact like this. Now, most channels have some type of activity. They have a subscription list, they have subscribers. Even channels that do not produce content normally still have subscribers. Before I started producing content, I had at least a couple of subscribers. My very first subscriber to my channel was a creationist. I got into an argument with this person in the comment section of, I can't remember if it was a creationist video or a atheist video. I honestly can't remember. But after that debate, that person subscribed to me, I'm guessing, to keep an eye on me. So that's fairly common to have subscribers, even if you aren't a content producer. And in fact, Dawn's main account has 11 subscribers. She's not a content creator, but she has 11 subscribers. And we can see her subscriptions and her playlists and things like that. It's obviously an active account. Sock accounts, though, tend to be inactive. They're only used on occasion to pretend to be someone else and to come in and to leave comments. It's not something that someone normally uses for their personal enjoyment. So they don't bother, subscribing to channels or anything like that. Now, once again, not rock solid evidence, but it is suspicious. Okay then, so what is the third indicator? Well, the third indicator is that the sock account supports everything the main account says. No disagreement, but will come in and support every single thing said or done by the main account. Now, at this point, some people are probably saying, but Bane, aren't there tons of people in the comment section of Russian Deadpool's video doing exactly that to you? And that's true. There are a lot of people in there defending me and saying that Russian Deadpool was wrong. So let's have a look at one of them. Actually, let's have a look at the one that Obsidian Forrest replied to. His name is Ultra Good Guy League. So if I click on Ultra Good Guy League's account, you'll see he's got at least one subscriber. He has playlists, he's got liked videos, he's even got subscriptions, including myself. It looks like an active account. Now, if this was a sock account of mine, I would have to have invested a lot of time and effort into maintaining it. Time and effort I basically don't have. That's why most sock accounts look inactive. And in fact, it was Ultra Good Guy League who left a comment suggesting that I go have a look at Dawn's comment in the Earl Silverman video. So I'd have to be doing a lot of swapping of accounts and going around and liking videos and all kinds of shit to make Ultra Good Guy a passable sock account. It's a very, very different account than what we find with Obsidian Forrest. Now, at this point, some people may be asking a couple of questions. They might be saying, but Bane, Dawn did mention that she's had numerous accounts in her talk with Russian Deadpool. Yep, that's true. And people might also be saying, but Bane, don't you have more than one account? And this is actually true. I have my main account, which you're watching this video on, my Bane 666AU account. And I also have my second account where I do hangouts, which is Bane Speaks. And by the way, if you haven't subscribed, you really should go and do so. But the thing is, I'm Bane on both of them. I don't pretend to be someone else. Okay, I'm not Bane here and Bob over there or anything like that. They're both me. And there's no pretending to be someone I'm not. Whereas Obsidian Forrest clearly refers to Dawn as she, which would indicate that if it is Dawn, she's pretending to be someone else. Now, I do use the word if. Once again, no rock-solid evidence. It's purely speculation based on circumstantial evidence. Still far more than anything that Dawn has supplied at this point, by the way. But I'm just putting this here to let you make up your own mind, whether you think this is actually Dawn using a sock account, or it's just a big list of coincidences, which is possible. It could be another person from Canada who just happens to have a daughter who believes in exactly all the same things that Dawn does and uses exactly the same arguments and has very similar grammar. It's possible. It's also possible that Dawn is being dishonest. I'm just going to leave it up to you to decide for yourselves. And if you think I'm wrong, by all means, comment below. So my original intention for the end of this video was to do a 20 to 30 minute interview concerning Earl Silverman. It didn't quite go to plan though. The chat ended up going for almost 2 hours, and we occasionally did go off topic. So what you're seeing here is a cut down version because, let's face it, this video's gone on too long as it is. You don't want to sit through another 2 hours. So I'm only presenting a cut down version here. However, I will put up the entire 2 hours, almost 2 hours, on my second channel where I put my hangouts on my Bane Speaks channel. Actually, I'll put an annotation around here somewhere. So if you want to watch the whole thing, you can just click on that. Enjoy.
All right.
So I'm joined by Karen, and we're going to talk a bit about Earl Silverman. It was only a couple of days ago. It was the 3-year anniversary of his death. So I thought maybe we'd chat a bit about Earl. I never had the opportunity to meet him because I'm on the other side of the world. But you met him personally and knew him personally. Could you tell us a bit about who he was and what he did and a bit about the man?
He was a bit of an odd duck. He was a very compassionate man. He was very focused. He was almost monomaniacal in terms of what he saw as his calling. And I think he found his calling when he walked out of an abusive relationship and essentially found nothing but no services for men other than services available to batterers, so anger management and things like that.
Yeah, I've heard this quite a bit. The 1 in 3 program in Australia, which says that 1 in 3 victims of domestic abuse are men, has made that point before, that when men have called to try to get help as victims, they're being directed towards abuse services, services for abusers to get help.
Yeah, Denise Hines, she's done a lot of interesting research on sort of the other side of domestic abuse, the other side of intimate partner assault and intimate partner sexual coercion and things like that. And she actually authored a study on the experiences of men who reached out for assistance, reached out for help from, government funded programs and community services and things like that. And she found that a significant portion of men found that the only things they found, their experience was that when they called a hotline, a large minority of the time they were just laughed at by the person on the other end of the line. You're joking, right? And often they were referred. The person on the other end of the line was sort of helpful or seemed sort of helpful in the terms of like, oh, I'm going to give you a referral to this, service. And then they realized that it wasn't helpful because the service, when they called, was a batterer treatment program. So, yeah, you essentially have this situation where probably about 2/3 of men have had extremely, at least 2/3 of men have had extremely negative experiences when reaching out for help from any hotline, crisis line, domestic violence service, shelter, anything. There are a small handful of services that are for both men and women. Most of them operate primarily through the way Earl did, through private donations, private funding. They don't get a lot of support from taxpayer dollars. And so they're a little harder to find. When men find those, they tend to get help.
So would you say there's starting to be a change? It's starting to is there starting to be more help for men, do you think?
I don't think that there's starting to be, there's a little bit more help for men in terms of, crisis lines. The people on the other end are not probably as likely to laugh at you and call you an asshole as they were 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. But there really isn't a whole lot in terms of concrete support. There's a voice on the other end of the phone that's sympathetic. You're more likely to find that now than you were 20 years ago, than you were when Earl started his crisis line, right? That he operated out of his own pocket for over 20 years. But so you're more likely to get a sympathetic voice on the end of the phone, but that doesn't necessarily translate into actual services, actual assistance, actual, a roof over your head or anything like that. And it definitely doesn't necessarily translate into a system that can legitimate your choice to take your children out of an abusive environment. And this is one of the things that I stress over and over and over and over again, because I believe that men are less likely to use shelters when they're abused than women are. I think that many men are more likely to want to go to a hotel room or couch surf with friends or go stay with their parents or something, even live in their car, than go and seek help at a domestic abuse shelter. Okay, if they are leaving on their own with no kids in tow, right, a shelter may not be their first choice, right? But, I mean, it may be, but it may not be. And I think that they're less likely than women to feel like they need to lean on that. But one thing that shelters for men would do for men with children is it would legitimate their choice to leave with their kids, right? And this is one thing men do not have. Men have three choices when they have kids and their spouse is abusive. They can stay and take it, or they can leave without the kids, and that's abandonment. And they've just fucked over any custody battle that they might want to launch, right? Or
plus you're unlikely to leave your kids in that situation.
Yeah, no, of course. You stay and you take it to protect your kids. Or you leave and you are literally abandoning your kids, because there is no way after legal abandonment of that sort that you're going to get custody. So that's permanently leaving them in the custody of an abusive woman. Or you commit a felony, right?
By taking your kids.
Take your kids to a hotel, or take your kids to your parents, or take your kids, somewhere. And that's felony kidnapping and custodial interference and all kinds of other things, right?
That's only when men do it, though? I haven't looked at the law in this case, so...
Nobody. It's line 1 something. I don't fucking know. I'm not answering it. Anyhow, so you have this series of choices that men have. Now, women aren't facing this choice. They may have been facing this choice before Aaron Pitsey came into being, right? The exact same choice. But they don't face this choice now, because even if they don't go to a shelter, right, they have an entire system that exists to legitimate their choice to leave with their children, right? So all they have to do is reach out for help, right? And then it's on the record, right, that the reason she's leaving is because she's being abused. The reason she's taking her kids is because she fears for their safety, right? It legitimates that choice, right? But because there are very, very few services, and none of these services, mind you, are government approved, right? Very, very few of them are funded by the government, approved by the government, legitimated by the government, right? Because of that, there is nothing to legitimate a man's decision to leave with his children. So he's essentially stuck. If he wants to protect his kids, he's essentially stuck in the relationship. And there's really no exit strategy for him to leave.
You really need to change society's attitudes for that to change, right?
Society's attitudes absolutely need to change. It needs to, there is something to be said for legislative change and equality under the law and, gender neutral laws and things like that. But, the family, divorce law and family court law, right, on paper in the statutes, right, is generally gender neutral. That doesn't mean that that's how it's going to be applied. And when it comes to things like shared parenting bills, alimony reform bills, and so the renewal of the Violence Against Women Act, and all of these kinds of things, politicians need to realize that doing what Governor Rick Scott did just last month, maybe it was even this month, in vetoing an alimony reform bill, that it was the second iteration of this bill. The first one was in 2013, and he vetoed that one and expressed what was concerning to him and why he vetoed it. So those things were altered, and then he vetoed it again at the behest of the National Organization for Women and several other women's groups and feminist groups. He vetoed it despite it having passed both houses with overwhelming bipartisan support and having over 70% public approval. So this is a man who essentially allowed a special interest group to overturn the will of the people of his state and used his veto power to subvert and corrupt the democratic process against the will of the people. And how much you want to bet that he's not worried about getting reelected, right? That's what needs to change, right? Politicians need to realize, right, that when they do shit like that, it's political death for them, right? And they aren't going to ever get that message unless the public attitude changes.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think the first battleground is the public attitude towards male victims in general, not just domestic violence. But yeah, we need to accept that men can be victims as well.
Well, I think public attitudes, like every single legislative change, has been it's been preceded by a change in public attitudes. So, I mean, even if you look at, sort of the decriminalization of sodomy, right? Because sodomy used to be a crime. Being a gay man used to, land you in prison, or get you chemically castrated, or going further back, get you hanged. In England and even in Canada, progressive Canada, we actually put gays in jail, way back when. Public attitudes start to shift, right? And then there's enough. And sometimes it only takes about 10 or 15% of the population to be loud enough, right, about wanting a change, right? You have 10 or 15% of the people who are agitating for the change. You have a large minority of people who don't care either way. And you can even have a large minority of people who are actively against that change. But as long as you have that 10 to 15% of people making a good case, right, then they can change public attitudes. They shift the sort of the window of ideas that are considered to be polite dinner conversation, the Overton window, what's tolerable to be discussed in public. and then that influences legislation. So the idea is not to go in and start rewriting laws. I don't think that anybody has ever really made meaningful change just by going in and rewriting laws.
You need to reach a tipping point in public opinion.
Yes. And then the laws will change on their own.
Yeah, then the politicians will follow because that's in their best interest.
Mm.
But you said earlier that Earl ran a helpline for 20 years?
It would have been over 20 years. It was he'd been running it for 20 years when I met him, so maybe 20, 22 years, something like that. It was essentially, basically, when he realized there were no services for men, he started a helpline. And as far as I know, he did kind of the really grassroots stuff, like when you're trying to sell a sofa, you put up a poster and it's got the little, you cut the little tabs
rip the phone number off. Yeah.
And he did that. He postered everywhere in Calgary, if you need help, you're a man, you need help, your wife abusing you, blah, blah, blah. He did all kinds of stuff like that. He did outreach as much as he could. And he helped lots and lots of people. He was actually a very sort of close confederate with Senator Ann Cools. She was quite fond of him. And because she considers Aaron Pitsey to be her soulmate and soul sister, she said. She was the one who started the shelters in Canada. That's how she got appointed to the Senate by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, the father of the cuck we have in Parliament now, in the PMO's office. But Pierre Trudeau was not quite as bad as his son seems to be. But yeah, no, Pierre Trudeau was the one who said the government has no business in the nation's bedrooms when he decriminalized sodomy. He appointed Ann Cools, the first black female senator in North America, to the Senate. She is the longest currently sitting Canadian senator at the moment, and don't know whether she's looking to retire anytime soon. But she was actually fairly close with Earl, tried to help him out as much as she could. And you literally had this guy, a one-man army of one, and he was just trying to make a change. And I don't know whether he had savvy as far as marketing or as far as PR, right? But he was one of the most sincere people I ever have met in the course of this journey that I've been having through this movement.
So he was funding that out of his own pocket. There was no government help whatsoever.
No. He ended up getting one grant. He applied for a grant through, I think, the Ministry of Health and Human Services or something like that. And they gave him a single grant of $800.
Wow.
That's what he got over the course of over 20 years from the government for the services he provided.
So he started the helpline over 20 years ago. Where did he go from there? Because he started a shelter out of his own house, didn't he? When did he start that? And do you know how that came about?
He wanted to open a shelter for quite some time, and he was trying to get funding, and he was again applying to the Provincial Ministry of Health and Human Services because they're the ones who disperse funds towards victims of crime, victims of domestic violence, all of that stuff, right? And they kept telling him, well, domestic violence is a women's issue. So you have to be approved by SOW, Status of Women Canada, right? The minister responsible for the status of women, right? Which is a federal position in Ottawa. And it's essentially a cabinet minister, usually with Health and Human Services, sometimes with some other department, but they also have this other mandate, this other job to do, responsible for the status of women. Now, SOW has essentially veto power. If, say, the Ministry of Health needs to get a study or something to the Minister of Justice, if it pertains to women at all, if it pertains to something that's been designated a women's issue, so domestic violence, sexual assault, all of those sort of wage equality, wage parity, or whatever, equity, all of those things, right? If that report is going to get to the Minister of Justice's desk, it needs to first be vetted by the minister responsible for the status of women. And that report can stop right there on that desk and not go any further. Okay? This is the amount of power.
So there is an inbuilt bias then. So how are we supposed to get help for male victims if we see the problem as only affecting females?
This is one of the most atrocious things about what Earl went through, because he opened his safe house, I believe it was 2 or 3 years before he died, but he had been in a 7-year legal battle, right? Trying to get Human Rights Council hearing based on discrimination. You know, he wanted to make a complaint to the Human Rights Council that the government was discriminating against him because he was male. And he was doing this based on the 3 or so years prior to that he was shunted back and forth between the provincial Ministry for Health and Human Services, right, which would send him to Status of Women Canada, which would then say to him, well, that may be the case, but we are not responsible, right? We're allowed to discriminate against men, right? We're here for women. We're allowed to discriminate against men. Go to the Department of Health and Human Services. So then he'd go back and they'd say, well, but that's a women's issue. And they'd send him back to Status of Women Canada, and back and forth, round and round we go, right? Essentially, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms has one section saying, essentially, there shall be no discrimination on the basis of sex. And in the immediate subsection below it, there is a clause that essentially says, except when we discriminate in favor of women. It doesn't say that specifically.
But
given the body of case law, right, that is essentially what it means, right? The body of case law indicates that women are disadvantaged historically. And the bigger that body of case law is, the easier it is to prove the next case, even after women have overshot equality, even when women are actually privileged compared to men. It's because of that huge, like 50 years of case law backing up each case, right? It becomes easier and easier to prove that women are being disadvantaged by ever smaller things, even when they actually have the advantage, right? So this is an actual positive feedback loop that snowballs into a monster, right? And Earl came around at about the time that it had completely monsterized. And so essentially what you have is you have a constitution, right? Our Charter of Rights and Freedoms is our constitution that says all people are equal, but some are more equal than others. And you have a history, decades of case law saying women are disadvantaged. And the less disadvantaged they get, the easier it is to prove they're disadvantaged because of that case law, right? And here you have a man, one guy, with no lawyer, right, trying to get a human rights hearing. Human Rights Council is the body that decides cases based on discrimination, under the charter, or charter rights, violations of charter rights. He's trying to get a hearing, and all of this is standing in his way, right? And not only is all of this case law and this little subsection that puts the kibosh on equality in our charter standing in his way, but he's got 2 lawyers, right? One of them is hired by the province, works for the province, and the other one works for the Alberta network of women's shelters, right? And he's pro se. It's just him. It's just this
funding out of his own pocket. Yeah.
Yeah. The scruffy looking guy, right, who does building maintenance for a living, right? I guess he was like a superintendent of an apartment building, like a maintenance guy. And, and he's there trying to argue against these 2 lawyers, to argue for his right to even have a hearing, let alone his right to win a hearing, his right to even have a hearing. And he was denied a hearing twice.
And then we call this equality.
Oh, yeah. And so he, the second time he was denied a hearing, he opened his shelter.
Out of his own pocket.
Out of his own pocket and with some private donations. And he wasn't internet savvy enough. He was not PR savvy enough. I doubt he had ever heard of Twitter or, Patreon or, Patreon wasn't around, but if it was, he would have been like completely out of the loop on that. He really.
Am I correct? Am I correct in saying that the shelter was out of his own home?
I believe it was his own home. Yes, he renovated it. He bought a home and he renovated it, and he lived there. Right. I don't think it was his existing home. Right. I think he bought it specifically for that purpose.
Yep.
And but he lived there. It was his home. So
what happened next then? He opened the shelter, and what happened from there? How many years was it open?
Couple of years, 2.5 years. He helped out several men. It's really hard for me to say how many men he helped out. One of the things that was different about his shelter was he had to charge $20 a night. And that was because he got no funding.
Yeah.
So he had to charge. And it was one of those things. It was one of those things where if he felt like, if he didn't give you shelter, you'd be lying on the sidewalk, right? He would waive the fee. But if he thought that you could afford $20 a night, he would have to say, because he's operating it out of his own pocket.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's reasonable if he had no other choice.
Yeah,
if he's not getting funding, then he still has to keep the lights on, doesn't he? Yeah,
and it wasn't recognized. I mean, this is the one big thing too, right? It was sort of the media was aware of it, the government was aware of it, but it wasn't officially recognized as a domestic violence shelter by the government or by the Alberta network of women's shelters or the affiliated agencies that can actually bestow any kind of legitimacy again, on something like this, right? So it was entirely just a one guy just trying to do his best for people and for a cause and not getting any breaks at all. And eventually he just couldn't sustain the costs anymore. He went bankrupt. He was going completely broke. He lost the house. He had to sell it. And the day the new owner took possession, the new owner found him hanging in the garage.
And that was 3 years ago, on the 26th, I think it was.
Yeah.
So it's almost 3 years to the day.
I can't believe it's been 3 years. Holy shit.
Yeah, I think it was 2013.
2014.
Are you sure? I thought it
No,
was
13. I don't know. I can't.
I think it was 3 years
I'm
ago.
just like, it just seems so freaking recent to me.
Yeah, it's been a busy 3 years, I guess.
Well, and I mean, like, I can still see him across the table from me at Denny's saying, you know, trying to explain to me what it was like talking to a feminist domestic violence crisis worker on a reservation. And he's holding up his coffee cup and he's saying to me, okay, explain to me that this is a coffee cup and not a blue Mercedes convertible. Right? Because all your explanations as to how it's a coffee cup and not a blue Mercedes convertible, they're just going to go right over my head.
Like talking to a brick wall, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just remember that so vividly. Just, you know, what his voice was like, what he looked like, you know.
Did you know him? Did you know him well? Met him often?
Not often. I talked to him on the phone fairly often. Met him a couple of times. He was just this little wiry man. I always thought that when I first met him, I had thought he'd be bigger, right? But he was just this tiny little wiry man, small, shorter than me, weighed less than me, I'm sure. You know, gigantic beard, dirt under his nails because he worked for a living, did physical work for a living, and was just so sincere, just so genuine. And when I think of, you know, sort of, it was days after he killed himself that there were feminists coming out of the woodwork at, like, I forget whether it was Huffington Post or Slate or what.
Yeah,
right?
I think it was Slate.
Essentially saying that, oh, his problem was he was a difficult, angry man who refused to work within the system.
It's a bit hard to work in the system when the system doesn't recognize you, isn't it? When the system is working against you.
When the system tells you, you know, because the first hearing that he tried to get, they told him that it's not illegal to discriminate against men, and therefore he does not get a hearing. Right? It's perfectly legal in Canada to discriminate against men. And then so he wrote up an argument to present at his second attempt to get a hearing, and the judge, or the adjudicator that listened to it, actually said that it was might have been an appeals court judge, like an actual judge, said that it was a very good argument, that as times change, the law needs to change. The law is not static. The law is not a stone. It is a tree, right? And some branches die, other branches grow. And as times change and circumstances change, the law needs to change with that. And the judge said that that was an excellent argument. However, he was attempting to sue the government for sex discrimination, but because there was no agency, ministry, department, or even individual within the government whose responsibility it is to allocate resources for male victims of domestic violence, there is no one in government for him to sue. So, hearing denied.
You gotta love the system, don't you?
I know, but he just couldn't work within the system.
Oh no!
He just
obviously,
to work within the system.
Obviously, the system's impossible to work through in those circumstances.
Yeah.
I don't know what else you can do in those circumstances.
No, I mean, the best you can do is the best you can do, right? And he gave it his all. And in his suicide letter, he said that he hoped that his death would shine a light on the problem. And in light of that sentiment, I found that article by that feminist to be in massively poor taste, to put it mildly. That he, in part, right? I don't think this was his whole reason for committing suicide, but it was part of it, because I think that if he thought he would be more useful alive than dead, he would have kept going. But I think he really thought that he would be more useful dead than alive. He would be more useful as a martyr than continuing to beat his head against that brick wall over and over and over again.